have you ever wondered what really happens when the cameras turn off and Donald Trump stops performing for the public? Get ready, because what you will see now did not appear on CNN, nor behind the scenes in the Republican Party, much less on Fox News. This is one of those moments where the mask falls and the character dissolves, revealing not a leader but a man on the verge of collapse. An outbreak, a spectacle of fury, paranoia, and lack of control that he tried to hide at any cost. This episode, we take a deep dive into one of the most disturbing scenes in Donald Trump's hidden life, a real documented episode that remained in the shadow of what they call institutional security. But how do you hide an erupting ego hurricane? How to control a man who, outside of the podiums and interviews, behaves like an emotional time bomb ready to explode? And we're not talking about conspiratorial exaggeration. We are talking about an internal, hushed-up record classified as not authorized for public release, where internal sources describe Trump in an unstable mental state, an attack of rage that involved shouting, threats, insults, and a desperate attempt to censor everything and everyone around. But what drives a former president of the United States to this level of lack of control? What secrets were being discussed in that room? Who were the targets of your fury? And why, even among his most faithful allies, was there such a deafening silence about the episode? This channel is not here to repeat headlines. Here we open the chest of raw truth, where every revelation has weight, where every detail matters, and where the dramaturgy of power finds its breaking point. It's not traditional journalism. It is a political series based on real events with the flaws, outbreaks, and truths that the media tries to soften or hide. You've seen Trump scream in public. You've seen his outbursts on Twitter. You've seen his speeches filled with self-deception and worship of his own image. But what you will see today is different. Today we're going to expose what happens when he's surrounded only by his own ghosts. No scripts, no audience, no control. And the most disturbing, it wasn't the first time. Behind the scenes of power, the walls speak, and the reports that have reached this point outline a clear pattern. The man who promised to restore order lives in constant emotional disorder. The leader of America Strong collapses when reality confronts him, and in this episode, we will follow every step, every noise, every muffled scream of that night of fury behind the scenes of the Trump empire. If you already suspected that there was something much darker behind the media figure of Donald Trump, you were right. And if you never imagined his breakdown would be so graphic, so visceral, so frighteningly human, brace yourself, because the video he tried to delete could change his outlook forever. And now that you've come this far, take a deep breath, because what comes next isn't just revealing, it's disconcerting, and it will make you look at power and those who hold it with different eyes. If you've made it this far, it's because something about this story really caught you. And now, before I show you the darkest details of this outbreak, I want to make a sincere invitation. Share with me in the comments what you already suspected about Donald Trump's behind the scenes. Do you think this type of behavior is an emotional accident or part of a well-rehearsed pattern? Tell me. I'm reading everything carefully and putting my heart into each comment. Here, we build together a community that is not satisfied with shallow versions of facts. We seek to understand what is really behind the power game. And yes, your opinion matters. It is part of this collective puzzle. Oh, and if you value content that makes you think, that reveals what the media tries to hide, and that exposes the dirtiest side of politics with courage and intelligence, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. This helps this content reach more people who, like you, are tired of swallowing ready-made narratives. Now yes, hold on tight, because what comes next will show you what Donald Trump did when he thought no one was watching. You're not ready to see this, and it's not an exaggeration. Trump doesn't want you to see this video, and when you understand why, you'll wonder how he managed to maintain that facade for so long. How? This character, built under spotlights, campaign chants, and carefully scripted catchphrases, got so far while hiding so much. Because what's about to be revealed here isn't just another uncomfortable behind-the-scenes story of power. It's a breaking point, a real documented moment that was buried by the allies themselves out of fear of the impact it could cause. What you will see now is a rare piece, a fragment of what happens when the cameras turn off, the microphones are left on, and the myth of emotional stability falls apart in a closed room. A collapse, an outbreak, a Donald Trump that few know, but many already suspected existed behind the public performance. It's the raw version of the man who led the country, who shaped global narratives and who still draws millions of followers, even when the mask begins to crack. We start right there, on the day everything fell apart. Quick cut to the headline: close sources confirm Trump's emotional outburst after emergency meeting. The news came and went. It was hushed up as quickly as it was published, but that's what we're here for, and to go where traditional media didn't have the courage to expose what was pushed under the carpet. And now I ask you a question that hasn't left my mind since I had access to the content of this episode. Why does such a powerful man, surrounded by resources, advisors, and control over his own image, act as if he were on the verge of a nervous breakdown? What kind of pressure, fear, or insecurity is hidden behind that tone of voice, those gestures, that desperate attempt to maintain control even when everything around is falling apart? You've heard fiery speeches, you've seen carefully staged interviews, but he never saw that, because this content was deleted, cut, edited, and, according to close sources, classified as institutional risk material. But if you're here, it's because you want to go further, and you will. Just tell me one thing before we continue. Did you ever suspect that there was this hidden side behind the Trump that the world was applauding? Comment if you want, I always knew, or even, now everything makes sense. I want to know who is here really ready to see what comes next, because what you're going to hear now wasn't meant to be public, and perhaps that's why it's exactly what needs to be shown. That afternoon, the event was scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. It was a press conference that, at first glance, seemed routine, official. Theme: national economic security, one of those generic subjects that serve as a showcase for prepared speeches and catchphrases. The scene was set as always, flags lined up, institutional background, a selective audience of journalists and advisors, all positioned to the millimeter. Trump entered with his usual theatrics, a forced smile, a tense expression trying to simulate confidence, but something was different. To the most attentive eyes, the discomfort was evident. In the first few minutes, Trump got the name of one of the projects he had announced weeks earlier wrong. He corrected himself but tripped again. His gestures were accelerated, his hands were agitated, and he avoided direct eye contact with reporters. The body language of a man cornered but trying to maintain his pose. One of the cameras even captured a moment in which he interrupted his own reasoning, looked away from the teleprompter, shook his head, and simply changed the subject, as if reality itself was beginning to fail around him. After about 13 minutes, the press conference ended abruptly. No questions, no interactions, no justifications. His face as he left the pulpit was that of someone holding back an explosion waiting to happen. The forced smiles evaporated. The quick, almost impatient step contrasted with the slowness of the security guards around him. Behind the scenes, as the equipment was turned off and journalists collected their pads, the atmosphere changed. What no one expected was that one of the microphones accidentally, or on purpose, who knows, remained on. And what that microphone captured became what can be described, without exaggeration, as the moment the facade crumbled. As soon as he entered a private room with his team, away from the cameras and the press, the tension exploded. The sound that followed was an altered voice, full of anger, a scream, then a sequence of disconnected sentences, full of frustration, accusations, and veiled threats. This has become a circus. Who let this leak? Who's selling out? Trump's voice echoed in the muffled environment, captured with distortion by the still-activated microphone. It was no longer the calculated tone of a politician in front of the public. It was the brutal lack of control of a man who had just been exposed in his most intimate flaws. According to internal reports, 2 advisors tried to intervene and calm the situation. One of them just whispered, "Sir, we can resolve this." Strategically, the response was a sharp knock on the table and a "shut up, don't tell me how to act, I know what I'm doing." Another noise, the sound of an object being thrown against the wall. What was supposed to be another carefully rehearsed ego show turned into a private meltdown. And what came next was scary. If you had access to the advisors' faces at that moment, you would see the panic in their eyes. It wasn't just fear of losing my job, it was the fear of witnessing something that could no longer be ignored, something that goes beyond politics and exposes the personality of someone who was at the center of global power for 4 years. Now, leave here in the comments what caught your attention the most so far. If you want, Right, the theater is over, so I know that you are following this content with the attention it deserves. And it says, do you think this behavior was punctual or just the first of many that are still hidden? Because what happened after that door closed, it's not over yet. What was heard in that room was more than just an outburst. It was the explosion of a wounded ego, the collapse of a persona built over decades based on force, domination, and manipulation of public image. Donald Trump's outburst, recorded by a microphone that remained on without his knowledge, is an intimate and violent portrait of a man who, when cornered, chooses to attack before admitting any weakness. And this attack was direct, personal, ignited by screams that went through the walls of the room like blades. The environment, according to internal reports, was that of a hotel office reserved only for private meetings. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, the lights kept to a minimum. There were no journalists, there were no official cameras, just a close circle of advisors and strategists, the same ones who were with him at critical moments in his political trajectory. But that day, not even these familiar faces escaped the fury. You sabotaged me, he shouted, his voice hoarse, crossed by heavy pauses, as if he swallowed his own anger between one sentence and the next. I don't trust any of you. None. This has become a circus, and you're the clowns. The sound of something being thrown hard echoes next. According to those who witnessed the scene, it was a glass object, possibly a glass, that hit the wall and shattered on the floor, causing total silence for a few seconds. And then the tone changed. It became lower, more restrained, but even scarier. You think you can betray me and get away with it? You're going to pay for this. I made every one of you. I put you where you are. And if I want, I'll take it all back. The sentences were captured in parts, with noises in the background, voices trying to interrupt. Someone saying, "President, please, we need to remain calm," to which he responded only with, "Shut up, I am calm." The level of tension increased with each second, as if the room was about to explode, not from a physical act, but from pure emotional instability. There was no strategy at that time, there was no political calculation, no action. It was Trump, the man behind the character, confronted by a feeling he had always tried to stifle, that of no longer having absolute control of the narrative. The loss of control over the situation, the possibility that there was betrayal within his circle, brought to light what many had already described, but few had witnessed in such a direct way. It's as if he's possessed by childish rage, but with nuclear power within reach. And this is not a metaphor. We are talking about someone who occupied the most powerful chair on the planet, with access to military, diplomatic, and strategic decisions of global impact. And in that instant, what we saw was a broken, paranoid, angry man who seemed willing to crush anyone who threatened his authority, even if that someone was part of his own team. And yet, there were those who tried to justify it, who, behind the scenes, minimized everything as a moment of stress. But the eyes of those in the room said something else. The reports, the quiet voices in the hallways, the silent dismissals after the episode. All of this shows that the outbreak was not just serious, it was unacceptable, and perhaps irreversible. Now answer me honestly, do you think this was just an isolated episode? Or has this behavior always existed and is only now starting to leak? Tell me in the comments. If you want, write "I heard everything" or even "This explains a lot," just so I know that you are following closely, connected with every detail, because what comes next will further deepen the abyss that opened that day. And believe me, there is still more being hidden. This type of outbreak, like the one you just heard behind the scenes that day, is not an isolated case, much less a surprise for anyone who seriously follows Donald Trump's public and private behavior. Clinical psychologists, personality, experts, and even members of his former government team have been warning for years. The former president does not know how to deal with humiliation, and when he is confronted, when reality clashes with the grandiose image he has built of himself, what happens is always the same thing: explosions, attacks, chaos, and at the center of it all, a fragile figure, but aggressively committed to appearing invincible. This pattern of reaction has already been seen in countless public moments. Remember the presidential debates, when he interrupted endlessly, distorted data in real time, and, faced with any challenge, diverted to personal attacks. It was always the same tactic: escape from weakness, attack first. During press conferences, when journalists asked minimally critical questions, he lost control. He called reporters idiots, accused entire stations of enemies of the people, rewrote the facts on camera as if the truth were a choice. And in the early hours of Twitter, when no one confronted him live, the lack of control seemed even more evident. Impulsive tweets, angry responses to celebrities, attacks on former allies, outbursts against governors, judges, even the FBI itself. It was the perfect stage for symbolic revenge against anyone who, even slightly, dared to contradict the myth. But the question that many people still avoid asking is, where does this behavior come from? Why does someone so obsessed with power, success, and control react so disproportionately to the slightest criticism? The answer, according to scholars of the presidential mind, begins in the environment in which Trump was shaped. His father, Fred Trump, was known for his toughness, a ruthless businessman who taught his children that only the strong win and that the appearance of strength is worth more than any truth. There was no room for mistakes, doubts, emotions. Showing fear, weakness, or humility was not just frowned upon, he was punished with contempt. It was in this toxic environment that Donald grew up. He learned that the world is a constant battlefield, where too much confidence is naivety, and losing under any circumstances is the greatest shame possible. Therefore, even surrounded by allies, Trump sees betrayal in any disagreement. That's why, even at the top, he acts like he's being persecuted all the time. It's the mentality of a boy who never felt good enough for his father, and who spent his entire life trying to prove that he's the biggest, the best, the most feared. But there is a name for this in psychology: narcissistic breakdown. It is the moment when the individual with marked narcissistic traits finds himself faced with a real threat to his idealized image, and reacts as if he were fighting for his own survival. There is no filter, there is no logic, there is no strategy. There is only a need to destroy the source of the threat. And if this threat is internal, if it comes from someone close to you, the attack is even more brutal. The outbreak you've seen here is just the most visible manifestation of this spiral. It happens when the character Trump can no longer support the script, when the weight of maintaining the myth exceeds the ability to feign control. And when that happens, those around pay the price. Advisors, allies, journalists, voters, sometimes even the family itself. This is why alertness is so important. Because when the myth of his invincibility is threatened, the world around him pays the price. And now I want to hear from you. After all this, what do you think fuels this behavior the most? Rigid creation? The inflated ego? The fear of being seen as weak? Comment below. If you want, write, "The myth is crumbling," to show that you are following each layer of this analysis. Because what comes next will expose how far this standard has really been able to go. The content that leaked from that room, even if in a fragmented form, had an immediate impact among those who were familiar with the game. It was not an explosion that reverberated in the media, did not make national headlines, nor was it debated by analysts in prime time. On the contrary, he was quickly swallowed by a rehearsed, controlled, almost choreographed silence. A silence that has become common whenever Donald Trump's darker side threatens to surface. The audio of the outbreak barely circulated among independent reporters before it was deleted from the networks. Accounts that published unofficial excerpts from the leak were taken down. Deleted publications. Those who reposted the content received warnings about guideline violations, not for spreading fake news, but for exposing something that should not be seen. The platforms did not explain the reason for the removal, but behind the scenes, sources close to the Trump team confirmed that there was an active effort to silence everything. Advisors were called to extraordinary meetings. Those involved in the event were required to sign confidentiality amendments, some, according to a report from a former employee who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity, would have been directly threatened with million-dollar lawsuits if they mentioned any details publicly. Others, with less resistance, were discreetly removed and replaced by more loyal figures, more willing to maintain the facade whatever the cost. There are even rumors that part of the original audio was edited internally and sent to specific allies in an attempt to contain the damage and prepare an official version of what would have happened. A difficult day, an understandable emotional reaction, nothing that deviates from normality. But anyone who saw the raw material knows that wasn't it. And anyone who heard the screams, the threatening words, the uncontrolled tone, also knows that it cannot be described as normal, not within any minimally functional political structure. What is worrying, and needs to be said clearly, is the speed and efficiency with which everything was erased, as if there were a machine ready, always on alert, to deactivate any inconvenient truth. And it's not the first time this has happened. We have already seen this with hidden documents, with investigations that did not advance, with witnesses who disappeared from the news without explanations. It's a pattern, and patterns, when repeated silently, become systems. The question that remains after all this cannot be ignored. If this is Trump's behavior when no one is watching, what else is being hidden? How many other outbreaks happened outside the range of microphones? How many decisions were made in a state of fury and later camouflaged as strategies? And to what extent can this type of emotional reaction still influence actions with political, military, or institutional impact? The next episode will touch precisely on this wound, because if you thought the collapse seen behind closed doors was the height of loss of control, wait until you find out how. Trump treated those who were once at his side out of duty, and not out of blind loyalty. War veterans injured in combat, used as a political showcase, and then discarded. Yes, that's what we're going to talk about. And what was done to them is perhaps the most revolting part of this story so far. But before we move on, I want to know what you think about all this. Tell me here in the comments. Do you think this pattern of behavior will continue to escalate? Do you believe that other truths are still being carefully erased? If you want right, they are hiding more than we imagine, or silence speaks loudly, just so I know who is following everything carefully, because this story is still far from over. After everything you've heard so far, you may be trying to digest the layers of this story, the tension behind the scenes, the muffled outbreak, the traces of censorship, the strategic silence. Maybe you're wondering, how far does this chain of manipulation go that keeps Donald Trump shielded from even his own actions? And most importantly, how come there are still people who look at all of this and say it's just politics, that it's an exaggeration, that none of it matters? But it matters, and a lot, because we're not talking about common mistakes. We are talking about emotional explosions being treated as strategies. We are talking about threats made behind closed doors, protected by contracts of silence, hushed up by allies who would rather protect the myth than face the man behind the farce. We are talking about a pattern of behavior that has already exceeded the limits of ethics, respect, and emotional stability, and yet it is still being defended as if it were normal. That's why this content needs to circulate, because it's not just about exposing a political character, it's about showing how power can be corrupted internally, silently, until it becomes something that scares those around it, but continues to be sold as leadership. And that's where the danger lies, in the contrast between what is said on the platforms and what is experienced behind the scenes. If this revolted you, if any part of this story made you see more clearly the size of the abyss that exists between the image and reality, tell me here in the comments. Comment, "I am not an accomplice to the chaos," if you feel that you can no longer ignore this type of behavior as if it were just another political episode. And if you can, share this video with someone who still believes that this is all just persecution, because maybe this person needs to see that the worst truths don't scream, they whisper behind the scenes. And for those of you who have stayed with me until now, I can tell you, what comes next is even more disturbing. Because if you think the outbreak we've shown here was rock bottom, wait until you see what Trump did to war veterans themselves, people who dedicated their lives to the country, men and women who served with honor, who bled for a flag he used as a slogan, but discarded without remorse when it no longer served his interests. It's simply unforgivable. If you want to see this next episode, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what's coming will challenge even those who thought they had seen it all. And finally, leave it here in the comments. What was the most revealing moment for you in this video? What part made you stop and think, this goes beyond politics? Write, if you want, the myth is crumbling, or the silence does not represent me, just so I know who is really watching, who is following with their eyes open, because you are part of this resistance to easy storytelling, and this story isn't over yet.